Hi, and thank you for clicking on this sewing tutorial. Today I'll show you how to make my Audrey 1951 dress. Let's begin, shall we? To prepare, I'm going to cut out all my pattern pieces. You have a list of pattern pieces in the sewing instructions, as well as some suggestions of cutting layouts. Of course, the final cutting layout always depends on how wide your fabric is, so you can be a bit creative with that. I am using an unbleached cotton fabric here, just because I'm making a mock-up for my Audrey dress. I made myself quite a few Audrey dresses before, but unfortunately, due to my pandemic pounds, I no longer fit them, so I have to make myself a new mock-up and make a new fitting. So sorry for the boring fabric choice here. After cutting out all your pattern pieces, clip into all the notches on your pattern. Except for clipping the notches, I always clip into the legs of the darts. Just to mark them, it makes the work much quicker for me. And after you're done with marking all the notches, of course, before making any sort of marks on your pattern or on your fabric, please make sure that you're doing it with the marker or chalk that's easily erasable from your fabric. I'm also showing you that I've cut out my lining pieces. The lining is going to be in pink just for the contrast. But yeah, please refer to the list of all the pattern pieces that you need to cut out. After cutting out all the pattern pieces and marking all the notches and all the darts and so on, it's time to interface a few pieces. The zipper area, both at the back of the bodice as well as the back of the skirt, and the collar pieces and cuff pieces. I start the project by overlocking all the side seam on skirt pieces, both front and back, and then overlocking all the pocket pieces. I leave the top of the pocket unoverlocked. I leave it without any serging. It's unnecessary and you'll see later why. Then the first thing I do at the sewing machine is sewing back skirt pieces together, stopping at the zipper notch. So I only sew to the zipper and stop right there. Next, I attach pocket pieces to the skirt front and back. So I do it at the side seams using 7mm seam allowance, and I go from the top of the skirt to the notch that's right there on the side seam of the skirt. And next I finger press the pattern pieces away from the skirt and towards the seam allowance on the side seam. Normally I would of course go to the ironing board, but this fabric is so stiff it doesn't really require pressing that often, but you be your own guide in this case, and if you feel like you need to iron your pocket pieces away from the skirt, please do that. And after I'm done with all the pocket pieces, I attach skirt front and back right sides together. So I put them right sides together. I put a pin in all the crucial points, like the bottom of the skirt as well as the notch at the side seam where the seam for the pocket ends, because that's where I'm going to pivot. You'll see in a moment. So I start sewing at the bottom of the skirt and I go up to that notch on the side seam of the skirt. I'm using 1cm seam allowance here. So once I get to that notch, I stop and pivot. Then I sew across the seam for 1cm, pivot again, and I go down to the pocket and I sew all around the pocket at 1cm seam allowance. When I get up to the top of the pocket, I backstitch, but I'm not done quite yet. I want to make sure that the pocket stays in place, doesn't move anywhere. So I sew 3mm away from that seam line I made previously, so that I'm not sure how to explain it properly, but basically I want to make sure that there is a 1cm seam allowance on the side seam of the skirt, both below and above the pocket. Then I take my skirt to the ironing board. I press all the seams flat. Here I clip into that point where the pocket meets the skirt, just to help that particular seam lay flat. And you'll see when we go to the right side of the skirt, that pocket should be invisible. Pressing that the pocket flat really helps with making that whole side seam even and flat. Next I start on the bodice, and the first thing I will do are the darts. So I begin with the front darts. You can see that I marked like a little cross right at the top of the dart where the dart should end. It just helps me orient myself. I used to mark the whole leg of the dart, but I found that to be just a waste of time. This way I feel goes much faster. After I sew all the darts both in the front and in the back, I'll press them towards the center, whether it's the center front or center back. And the bust darts I usually press up. So here you can just see me finger pressing all the darts. I do the same thing for the bodice lining. The whole bodice lining is constructed in the exact same way as the lining. After I'm done with the darts, I will connect my bodice front and back at the shoulder seams and side seams. The only difference when it comes to construction of the bodice lining is that you need to leave a hole in one side seam on the bodice lining. So you connect the bodice at the shoulder seam, one side seam, and then when you get to the second side seam, you only sew the top of the seam and the bottom of the seam, just to make sure that the bodice lining stays together. But you leave a whole wide hole open in the side seam, and I will later show you why. We will need it in order to bag the dress. That means we will attach the lining to the dress completely by sewing machine. We will not use hand stitching at all. Here I am at the ironing board and I'm pressing all my seams flat, and I press all my darts to make sure that they will stay facing in the right direction. I'm also pressing the seams on my bodice lining. Now I'll start construction of the sleeve in the version D, which is sleeveless, but we do attach a piping cord to the arm side. I do that with the zipper foot. I make sure that I have the piping cord the length of my arm side with a little bit extra. So I go all around the arm side with the zipper foot, making sure that I sew as close as possible to that piping cord. And then when I get to where I began, I make sure that those cords cross. So because I don't want to have any holes in my piping cord around my arm side. It will look really seamless if you begin sewing at the side seams. So the point where those cords cross over is under your arm. Next I will make a collar, first the simple version without the bias binding. So basically you put both collar pieces right sides together and sew at 5mm seam allowance. I chose to have 5mm seam allowance because that saves me time on trimming. We don't have to trim any excess seam allowance on that collar, and that makes the collar really smooth once you're done. So once I'm done sewing the two collar pieces together, I notch the curved edge of the collar. I don't want to over notch that seam because that weakens the seam considerably. So I try my best to notch it only at the crucial points where the seam is the most curved. Next, after that, we are going to flip the collar to the right side, and I use my nails just to flatten out that seam, especially in the points between the notches. It really takes a little bit of effort to make the collar really nice and round. After I finger pressed that collar, I take it to the ironing board and give it a proper press. Next, I will show you how to make the collar in version B. For that, I took bias binding tape. I made sure I have the whole length of the collar with a little bit of extra just to have something to spare. I have the bias binding that's store-bought, so it's ready-made and ready-pressed. The only thing I do is press it in half. So I unfold the tape and I press it in half. The side where it opens is going to face towards the seam allowance on the collar, and the bit where it's folded, that thing will face towards the collar when we attach it here at 5mm seam allowance. So you basically sew the bias tape to the whole collar at 5mm seam allowance. Once you're done with that, take the second piece for your collar and put them right sides together. Now the bias binding tape should be sandwiched between the two collar pieces. When you're done sewing the collar pieces together, we do the same thing as in the simple collar, which is notch the seam in the points where it's actually curved or where it's the most curved. and then we flip it to the right side, and I finger press the seam allowance here just to make it a bit easier for myself later at the ironing board, just to make it a bit easier to press without having any weird creases in it. Next, I baste the collar pieces to the neckline. The collar pieces will meet at the center front, and you can use the notches on the collar to orient yourself. So the notches will align with the notch at the neckline as well as with the shoulder seam. And I leave myself 1 centimeter wide space at the center back to fit the zipper. Once I have aligned all the notches on the collar and the neckline together, I baste the collar to the neckline at 5 millimeters seam allowance. Now this is a curved edge, so I take my time to realign my fabric as I go. I sew a little bit, I realign the fabric, make sure I'm not catching anything that shouldn't be caught in that seam allowance, and sew another bit, and then again I check that my collar and neckline are well aligned and there are no folds underneath the collar, and then I proceed and sew another bit until I get to the other side of the neckline.